Okay, let's try again for the third time. Um, as I mentioned, today's lecture will be recorded going forward. And now, ideally, my mic is working, so let us carry forward. As I was saying, what we are going to do is we're going to continue on with our setting up of our StungEye blog software. And really, at the end of the day, I hope I mentioned this when we first looked at this a lifetime ago now, it seems. I was always going to take this and add to it and make better and make better and make better. And that's really what this week and next week is all about, is finalizing that process. We added a login to it. We then made that login use encrypted passwords, making it a little bit more resilient. And we also ensured that the login system that we were using used proper tools to mitigate against SQL injections. So that's kind of what we've done so far. If you went through and did the activity that I asked you to do yesterday, you also ensured that you added a couple of extra fields to your registration form. That not only did you grab a username, but you also grabbed a password and a second password and a valid email address. And that you confirmed that those credentials were proper. Okay? The lecture was very straightforward. I'm really not worried about improper implementation of these things. They're very straightforward. What is important, however, is making sure that your database reflects what you've done. Okay, and that's what I'm doing now is I'm opening up my database software. And to be honest, there's value in having your database software open for today's lecture because we are going to modify our schema significantly. Okay, you have a members table, you have an email address, and when you take a look at the data, you may or may not have email addresses entered for those records. I do. You can add a record for email for one or both of those values, and it doesn't really matter. But you need to make sure that this is all in place for today's lecture. If not, again, we are recording this so that we can share it and you can pick up this work later on. Of course, this is all happening on Debian, but we don't need to log into Debian to do this because at the end of the day, we have, well, PuTTY, but we don't really even need PuTTY because at the end of the day, we also set up our environment properly so that we can create content through WinSCP. Even though we're not logged in as root, we've probably done the directory structure properly that allows us to do these kinds of things. Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm at a point like this, and please ignore my other backups, I did some milestone backup stuff in preparation for today because I can revert more quickly when I have milestone backups. But to that end, there is value in doing backups. And if you're using WinSCP, and I'm sorry for you Mac heads out there, I'm not sure what you're using. I can't remember what it's called. I'm drawing a blank, but it should have something similar to this that allows you to duplicate content. And that's what I'm doing here. Now that I'm at a milestone point, okay, the workbench, thank you for that, but this is not the database. At this point, this is the file system backup. So we're going to get to the database stuff in 1 second, okay? But thank you for that. FileZilla, or yeah, I think it's called FileZilla, that's what it's called. If you're using FileZilla or some other graphical tool, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, if you don't have a tool, and I'll just show you quickly, you can right-click, select duplicate, and then give it a new name. I'm going to call it blog_backup. And then click on OK. And it says, how do you want to do it? The default is fine. And then what it does is it makes a backup of your file system for you. Okay? If you do not have, for whatever reason, access to that, you can, of course, do it through the terminal. Okay? Debian with keys. Is it that one? Perfect. Because we set up our structure properly, I'm logged in as SJ, but I own that blog folder. So I can do cp-r to do it recursively, blog, and I'm going to call it blog_backup. I don't care how you do it. There's my blog backup, and when I refresh over here, I've got again my blog backup. I don't care. And frankly, you don't have to do this. But now is a good time to do a backup of your software. Also, and this is beyond necessary, now would be a good time to do a backup of your database before you screw that up. There's a number of ways of doing it. This is my workflow. You do you. And this now comes into what was raised before by Austin. I'm not sure exactly how you would do this with MySQL Workbench, but again, the process, the workflow is the same, even if the mouse clicks aren't exactly the same. What I do, because I want my backup in the same folder, so I will go into the WinSCP, right click, create a new file. And I'm going to call this database underscore backup.sql because my text editor, and it automatically opens it up with the default text editor, can handle that. And then what I do is I go to my database software, and at this time, I right click on the database. Keep in mind I'm already logged in, and with the SQLmanager.net tool, there's a subfolder for database tools, and you can extract a database. You can also go Tools, Extract Database, all right? Once you select along the left the database that you want to work with, when you select that, you can go Tools, Extract Database, or again, right click and there's a context sensitive menu. And it's a simple wizard. The blog, yeah, I want to back up my blog database. I suggest loading it to the script editor so you can take a look at it and make sure you're happy with it. You can save it as a file, but we're going to copy and paste it or upload it or whatever, right? This is my workflow. I load it to the script editor and I click on Next. Extract objects, perfect. I don't do generate or drop if exists. I don't do drop if exists. I'm assuming that I'm doing a complete restore. So I've dropped my old database. I use the defaults here. Again, your workflow is up to you. And then I run the process. And then once that's done, I have my script loaded. Control A, Control C, Control V, Control S. And then what happens is that it uploads that and then it creates the SQL file on my server. I can go through, make sure I'm happy with it. I can change this. I can do drop, create database or drop database if exists, and then create the database. I can go through and modify my SQL in much greater detail. Frankly, I'm happy with my script, so I'm going to close that down. And now I have a backup. Are there any questions? Does that make sense? Again, that was working in the blog backup. I want to now update my blog, so I have to change directories in a WinSCP. So again, go to HTML, don't be in blog backup, ignore my other backups, these are just workflow things, select blog. And in blog, now we can start making our changes as per the Word document that ideally you have already looked at. Let's see if this is the right one. Okay. All right. Are there any questions? Okay. So I'm going to be working off of this Word document today. It's 6 pages. It's pretty straightforward. I would be very surprised if you could not do this work on your own. I would be incredibly surprised if you couldn't do this work on your own. It is very straightforward stuff. And what we're going to do is a couple of things. This is going to be the workflow for today. We have to modify our database a little bit. To do that, we are going to do two things. We're going to run the script, as I made reference to in the PowerPoints in our class yesterday. We're going to run a script. It's going to create the necessary tables. As we see here, it's going to create these tables for us, and it does populate it with some default information. Okay? Basically, it adds a user root to the system. Now, we're not going to use that. We're going to create our own user, and we're going to call it admin. It is very important that you understand at this point that my ID for admin is 9. One of the nice features about PHP RBAC, the tool that we are going to use in our lecture today, is that it runs alongside whatever you have. If you have an ID, grab a session variable for it and use that session ID to look up the permissions that you want that user to have. Okay? And then you simply configure the application to use that. As I mentioned in the lecture yesterday, this is a very popular, mature, and recommended tool set for granting role-based access controls into web applications. And that's one of the reasons why we are using it. Any questions? Okay. For this to work, you need to do a couple of things. I'm going to move this off to the side, and I will, as necessary, refer back to it, but by and large, I won't have that visible. Okay. Give me a second to get set up here. I don't want to miss any of my steps. Okay. So, one of the first things you need to do is to download and open up the PHP RBAC content. Once you have it unzipped, you have a folder called PHP RBAC. Okay, and you're going to need to upload this file, this directory structure, to your instance of your blog software. Okay, I suggest uploading it as is. If you change the directory name, that's fine. You are welcome to, but if you change the directory name, you will have to change the directory name in the code, keeping in mind, of course, that Linux is a Unix, and in Unix, case matters for file names and directories. So if you want to just use the code as I've given to you in this document, I recommend that you have the exact correct name for that document, for that directory, I should say. Okay? And then when we take a look at it, right away I have a problem with this. Right away I dislike what they've done here. And this is just me. This is the way that I operate. Your mileage may vary. But now that I've uploaded this directory, PHP RBAC, I see there is no default HTML loader, like index.html, default.php, index.php, whatever. And your response may be, well, who cares? And that, in this case, to be honest, is a valid response. If I go to my IP address, and I go to Case Matters, PHP RBAC, I can see the directory contents. This is never good, especially when there's a folder and a file named config. Now it doesn't load. When we take a look at that in a second, there is some PHP code to avoid it. But that's risky. I don't like that. There's also a file called MySQL, which, when we save that file, we can actually take a look at the contents of what they did, which again is risky. You never want to give hackers any chance. So my one and singular, frankly, it is really my only complaint that I have about this, is that there isn't a index.php or an index.html file in this folder. When I roll this into production, I would put that there to make sure that nobody could do some directory enumeration to see what's going on. Okay? To that end, the directory name itself, PHP RBAC, is probably less than ideal. It is allowing hackers an understanding of the code that you are using, and any enumeration is bad. So even though I recommend not changing this, if you were to roll this out into a project, I would call the directory something other than PHP RBAC. I would use, and we will see the table prefix in a second, I would use something other than PHP RBAC as a table prefix. This is an academic exercise. We will ignore those considerations right now. Any questions? Okay. A couple of things. And I'm just going to go back to my couple of things. We've got a database config. Hopefully, this will open up in your preferred text editor. If it doesn't, select Edit and make the appropriate changes. When we take a look at this folder, there is a file called install, and frankly, it simply doesn't work. So I hard code my configurations, and then things work a lot better, I find. But that's me, okay? So what I like to do is two things. I like opening up the mysql.sql file. When I open it up, this is the code I'm going to run, but I need to change the prefix, okay? You might be able to get that script. You might be able to change the database config and get that install script to work. I just do it manually because I find that's the best, but that's me, okay? So I've opened up both the config file and the mysql.sql file, okay? I have both of these open in my preferred text editor. And I gotta say, the video today is quite a bit better than I thought it was going to be. That's good. First things first. There is a prefix, and we talked about this yesterday. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But at the end of the day, open source projects these days use table name prefixes, a uniform table name prefix that is set in the configuration. That's what they're talking about here. The default prefix is PHpRbac. We will use that. At the end of the day, when you roll this into production, I would change that into something else. You could set it to something like, in honor of my high school math teacher, who was a little crazy like me, her favorite variable name was Charlie Brown Kite Eating Tree. That was her favorite variable name, Charlie Brown's Kite Eating Tree. You could use that. You could use whatever you want. We are, of course, just going to leave it at PHpRbac. Just like that, okay? So, because that's our table prefix, we are going to set that before we run this script, okay? So our prefix, we are going to change the prefix to whatever you want. Whatever you set it to, make sure that it matches in the configuration next. I just changed the string prefix. Actually, you know what? Prefix underscore to PHpRbac underscore. And then it's a little bit more specific. You have an exact character match. Replace all. You should only get 8 changes. When I do replace all, I get 8 items replaced. I should be good. You do not want to do all open files, obviously. Okay? So I can cancel that, and it looks good. PHpRbac, PHpRbac, PHpRbac. Perfect. Now, I wouldn't save this. To be honest, if I save this at this point, I have uploaded my table schema. To be fair, the prefix is going to be in the config file anyway, so the information's there. But again, the mindset of not sharing information unnecessarily. Now that I have modified my table name prefix, I can Control A, Control C, go over into my database tool, and I can close that script down. I don't need it. And I'm going to open up a new script. All right. There's different ways of doing it. Show the SQL editor, open up a new SQL editor. We only want one. So I'm going to open up the SQL editor, and I'm going to paste my code. Okay. If you want, you can add a line that says use the blog database, use blog. But when you take a look, and I'm just going to make things a little bit bigger, and I know it's difficult for you to see, and I'm sorry about this. But when we take a look here in our interface, it tells us what database we are using. So when I run this script, it is going to be against this database. And then when I click on execute, let me make this a little bigger so you can see the results. When I click on execute, it will tell me that it had, I can't remember, 8 commands that are successful or something like that. And that's what we want to see. We want to see a listing of okay, 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 okay. Over along the side, we see no new tables until we select tables, right click, and refresh. And when you do that, you see you have 4 new tables. You only need to do this once, all right? If you screw up, you can rerun this script to purge and repopulate, and you will see what I'm talking about in a sec, okay? Actually, no, you can't. You need to drop table if it exists, so that's not even here. So now that we're done, we don't really need this anymore. We can close that, although it's probably still in the buffer for it. Okay? Any questions? Now that we have our database created, there's one more thing we want to do. I want to create a user called admin. Okay? The best way to do that at this point is likely to go through the registration page. Create a user called admin, admin at rrc.ca or whatever, it doesn't matter. Password's going to be password again and password yet again. If I haven't screwed up my application, it should show it as registered, and I'm going to save that and then log in as admin and password and save that. Yes. Okay. So now I am logged in as admin. I have an admin user. When I refresh my table data, there is that user now. Okay. So those are the 2 things we need to do ahead of time before we start getting into those. I should say are the 2 database components we need to do ahead of time. We need to create the necessary tables. We also need to have the user that we want to set up as admin. I have set up an admin user. You can use any of the existing users you have. Just please pay attention to the ID field, because that's what we are going to use to assign these role-based permissions, if you will. Okay? My ID at this point is 5 for my username. Okay? My username is admin. The user ID is 5. I need to keep that in mind going forward. Not the next step, but the step after, I believe. Are there any questions? Please note your user ID that you want to use for the specific username that logs in. Hopefully, you do not have duplicates. At this point, you should have a system that mitigates against duplicate entries. If you do have duplicate usernames, delete those records, please. The way to delete a record is to select the record and then hit the minus to delete the record. Okay? I'm not going to do that because I have the record that I want to create. Are there any questions? If there are no questions, let's move on. The next thing I want to do is start configuring content in my system. So I'm going to minimize my database software for right now. I don't really need that. I don't need the MySQL open anymore. I'm going to close that without saving because, again, I mean, and if you want to, you know what, I'm going to close this and I'll say, hey, do you want to save that? I'll say yes. And then my changes have been saved to the SQL file. But I'm going to show you why that's risky in a second. The next thing I want is to understand what arguments I need to set in this file. All right? The prefix is fine. We are not using SQLite. In our application, hopefully you are using PDO. So we're going to modify this config for PDO. Because we are using PDO, we do not have a directory structure for our database name. All right? Our database is not called PhpRbac. In my case, my database is called blog. You need to change the database name to reflect that. Okay? My username, and please, please, please tell me none of you are using root as your username to connect to your database. Okay? If you're unsure what your database name is, it should be blog user or something. You should have 2 IDs. I do not want you to use the credentials here. There should be something like blog admin here that allows you to create and destroy objects. You should have a separate user for connection. That separate user is part of your connection string. I think mine's called config. Here it is, blog user, and the password is simply password. And I want to reflect those here. So it's not root, it's blog user, and the horrible password of password, which we should never do. Nevertheless, here we are. Okay? So I've defined a host, a user, a password, and a database. Everything looks good except for the fact that there is no end PHP tag. Strictly speaking, not necessary. Strictly speaking, it would probably work without. Strictly speaking, I can't handle something like that, so I'm going to have an end PHP tag because that's the kind of anal retentive person that I am. Okay, save that, and you should have a proper database connection. And we'll know in a second, okay? Because the next thing we are going to do, not next, but one of the things we're going to do is we're going to set up admin in the PHP RBAC tables so that we can give one of our accounts the ability to go to the admin page, or maybe go to the create content page if that's what you want to do. Are there any questions? Just to recap, we ran the script to create and populate the tables in our blog database. Before we ran that script, we ensured that the script had the correct table prefix that we wanted to use. Once we set that up, we ran the script, it created the tables, and we can see those tables in our database software. As you can see here in the column, where's my scroll bar? I guess I don't have a scroll bar. PHP RBAC permissions, roles, role permissions, user roles. There's a bunch of cross-referencing or processing entities that you can see there. Okay. There we go. Better. The interface is a little dicey when you're trying to reclaim as much real estate as possible. Any questions before we move on? Hopefully at this point, everybody has those tables, everybody has the configuration necessary so that PHP RBAC can talk. And again, it's one of the beauties. And to be honest, we can delete those commented lines if we want. But again, one of the beauties of this is that we don't have to go through and modify our code to work with it. It will run alongside with whatever it is we're using. Okay? So let's take a look at the next bit. I can close this because I no longer need that. I no longer need my config information. I'm going to assume that's okay, and I can start populating my code. First things first. The next thing I want to do is modify my login page. Now, I don't know if I made this clear yesterday or not, but I hope I did. There is a benefit in having a single login page rather than having a login and process login like we had in our login examples when I first showed you proper encryption of login hashes using salts. When you take a look at what I created, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I don't have a login and a process login. All right, I know there's a process post, but that's from Kyle, and you do you, I do me. When it comes to these kinds of things, I like single containers, and I know it doesn't allow for the new development model. This, of course, can be modified for that new developed models or methodologies, but for educational purposes, I have everything in my login page. All right. If there's a login, then I go ahead and I log in. All right. If there is no password, then I show the form. Okay. I have the wrong one in place. Okay, so give me 1 second. I have the wrong stuff in place. So give me 1 second. You can take a break. I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. Just give me 1 second here. Okay, the email's there. So let's do this. Okay, let's see if that worked. Oh God, that's long and tedious. Well, all right. Well, we'll just make do for now. I'll fix it later. I'm obviously not capturing my password here, or my email address, I should say, but we'll deal with that later. Frankly, it's not really necessary, but that should have been in place. But that's okay. Regardless, the joys of code development too quickly. Okay. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to understand that RBAC uses that user ID from our database, okay, which is right here. Okay, in my case, it's ID 5, but we need that. That needs to be one of the session values that we work with. So one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to modify my login page to use that. Okay, I've closed the login page. I'm opening up the login page, which is hopefully the right one. This is still not the right one. Well, hopefully I don't. I might have to do some manipulation again later on as well, but this is still not the right one. Okay? So for our login page, we are setting a session somewhere in your login page. You're setting a session for the username. All right? Wherever that is, you should also set a session for the user ID. Okay? And that's what I'm doing here. I need to add a session for the user ID as well as the username. Now, my query is based on a result set called pass, all right? So I need to not only grab the password, but I need to grab the ID and the password, okay? So there's a couple of changes that need to be made here, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted you to download the updated version of the Word document, because I failed to identify ID as a bold character in the original one. So you have to grab the ID in your query and then set the user ID session value to the ID that you're pulling from your database. All right? Once you've done that, you now have a proper session ID. Save that. It should automatically upload it. Log out and log back in. So now you have your session loaded, the ID loaded. Okay. I have another issue. Okay. Don't worry about it. Please ignore the man behind the curtain. Okay, any questions? Now that you've done that, and right now I'm on page 2 of the handout that I've given you, what I want to do next is to create a relationship between roles that I want to create inside of PHP RBAC and an administrator role. All right, there's going to be a permission, it's to be administrator of the site. There's going to be a role, and it's going to be administrator. And then when I do this, I need to create relationships between all of those. Fortunately, RBAC comes with some sample scripts to do this. Now, they also come with the necessary things. If you go to the website, you can take a look. They'll also give you some stuff that you can drop into your website so you can create an administrative portal. That was a horrible choice of words. To create an administrative portal into your system to allow you to say, hey, add this user, and then it'll create all the relationships that are necessary. You, of course, can do that. You, of course, can make those changes. But for the purposes of today, I just want to show how you can get this working. To that end, I have a script here that I am going to run. Okay? We run it only once. Again, note that you must change the admin ID to whatever ID that you have in your members table or whatever you called that table. Okay? Because we are now capturing that unique ID, we can use that information here, and then it'll just grab that ID as a session variable, look up the roles that that ID has associated with that username, and then move forward. Okay? So we're going to create an admin user, or a permission. We're going to create an admin role, and then we're going to create a relationship between that admin and that role ID of 9. And then we create all those relationships here. And that's what this script does. But as I said here, we're only running this once per role and relationship that you want to create. Okay? For our sample, we're only creating one administrator, so we're only going to run this once. So I highlight all that, copy it, and then I need to paste it somewhere over here. To be honest, I found the easiest way to do this is to select something simple like the create.php. Click on that, duplicate it, and this we're going to call it create admin run only once. Okay, which is an incredibly long and difficult script name, but that's good. Then we're not going to accidentally run it more than one time. Now that I have my script in place, my PHP script, double click on it to open it, Control A, Control V, and then my code is in place. Again, I must modify this ID, for me it's line 30, with the ID from my database. When I look at my database, again, my ID is 5 for the account. That must be reflected here. My ID is not 9, my ID is 5. Okay? Now that I've done that, it's really the only edit you need to do for this code. You can save it, and then you run it once. The file is, I did file save as, and when I did that, it shows me the file name, Control A. I'm going to save that file name, cancel. It's been uploaded to the server. I can run it here. / and then that file name, and enter. All right. It has a session warning. That's fine. It says you have successfully created the admin roles. Perfect. That's exactly what I want to see. Okay. What was I going to say? If you get an error on this page, chances are you have an error in your config file. An error here is most often a reflection of an error in your config file for PHP RBAC. So again, I'm recording this session. You can refer to it later. You can still make these changes, you just can't test them. Does anybody have a question, or does anybody want me to take a look at anything? Okay, very good. Let's move on. And in case you're wondering why I'm doing this in such excruciating detail, I'm sure you've seen that there's a competency in the gradebook on this. So that's why we're spending time, to make sure that we get it right. Okay. Now that I've done that, frankly, at this point, I don't need this. And frankly, I don't need this anymore either. And to be fair, I could probably go back to my file transfer utility. I don't need that. I could probably go back into my blog and I could delete this file. Okay? Your choice. You can delete it, you can archive it, you can change it so it can't be run again. The choice is yours. In a production environment, you can bet that I would delete that file. Okay? You don't want those kinds of things sitting there. Also, there's an install script. Get rid of that as well. We never ran it, but we don't have to run it. The install script configs our configuration script, so we need that. The autoload.php, we need that. All right? The database scripts, we really don't need either one of those because we've run them. So we can delete both of those files if this was a production environment. It's not a bad idea to adopt that philosophy. Source, I would leave that because it uses it. Tests, you could take a look at that, use them or don't use them if you wish. Okay? Any questions on that? Let's see if I didn't screw up my application. Anytime I make changes like that, I of course log out, home, log in, admin, log in, perfect. Hopefully it's working. Log out, home, log in as someone else, log in, perfect. All right. So I'm going to assume that I'm logged in as admin at this point and everything is working. That takes us past page 3. And at this point, there is one of the worst screen captures I've ever done on page 3, but it will show you that by running that script, you now have a bunch of extra data in your database based on the new admin and administrator roles created, including a new relationships in the PHP RBAC user roles lookup table. And let's take a look at that in the database so that we're all on the same page. Now that I've run the scripts, you should see more than one record. Before there was just root. Now there's root and the admin one that we created. There are some roles that have been created as well. Perfect. That's supposed to be a date time field. Obviously it's done poorly. The roles have been created. Again, a date timestamp, but an admin role. The important one is PHP RBAC user roles. When you take a look at this, the admin role in PHP RBAC is 2. The user ID from my members table should be the same as the user roles one here. This is a lookup table. This is not a primary key. This is a foreign key. This is clearly a composite primary key that we have going on here, although I doubt that the restrictions are in place. You could probably adjust that. If you have the wrong user ID, go in here and change it. If you want to test, for example, give in your other record, like for me it would be SJ, or if I wanted to give John admin access, I could go into this table here and modify, or frankly duplicate that record. You can duplicate that record with another different user ID. Okay? That's what's happening with these tables. Any questions on that? Any questions? Perfect. So that's what we're talking about on page 2 of the handout. Page 3 of the handout. On to page 4. Okay? As I was mentioning before, the auto load that we saw in the PHP RBAC folder needs to be used every time you want to use this. Another thing we need to do is to, after we've loaded the auto load for PHP RBAC, we have to say use it and then define a new instance of the RBAC class, I guess. We can do that on every page that we want to use it, but if you have set up the StungEye software as Kyle had intended us to set it up, you've got something that gets loaded on every page of your blog software. And that is the menu. So what I do is I like to make these changes on the menu page. Okay, so if you take a look at the top of page 4, actually a little bit further down on page 4, I've got some code that I'd like to suggest that we modify our menu page with. Okay, before we do the isSet statement, what I like to do is I like to add the require once statement for the auto load for PHP RBAC, and I put that right there. Okay, require once, and because it's on the menu and pretty much every page on our site should use that the user views, we should add that code. All right, once we've done that, we can then add the subsequent code necessary. I have moved my session information into that page, so that's why I was throwing that error. I would load your RBAC stuff after that because we need to grab the session information. Okay? We don't use it yet, but we will use it. Okay? So actually this doesn't really matter where because it's not tied to that. Okay? So yeah, I add that code. Again, I'm adding this all on the menu page. Any questions? Well, that's why I did it. I moved the session here so I could set up a custom, that's why I did it, I remember now. I created a bit of a, if I'm logged in, you know, don't show me the login and register page, show me the logout page. If I'm not logged in, if I'm logged in, I want to see logout. If I'm not logged in, there shouldn't be a logout button, but give me the option of logging in or registering. To do this, I checked the session information. To do that, I loaded my session information as part of the menu. Now every page has that, and I don't need to do that specifically. That's what I did. I remember that now. Okay? Any questions on that? Okay. Now that I have that done, I'm at the bottom of page 4 and through onto the top of page 5. I want to add a new menu item after, well, it doesn't really matter where. Okay, I'm going to add it after my privacy statement. I'm going to add a block of code here. Obviously, there's something wrong because it's missing something. It's my syntactical highlight is showing me that I have something missing here. Okay, so I need to add a PHP statement. Okay, so start PHP if is that session username, all right, and I am checking the role ID against the session user ID, which we grabbed before. We should have that now, all right, if that matches the role ID variable, which I set up here. The role ID is, rather than going through and hard coding, I want to assign it to this role, admin. So PHP RBAC returns the necessary ID, and then we assign that to the role ID. I check, I use it. Does it match? Perfect. If it does, great. RBAC does all that work for us. We don't have to mess around. So if there is a user session and the role matches for that user ID, allow the admin page to be, the link to the admin page to be displayed. Okay? If I don't have any bugs in my code, I always love doing code in front of students in real time. That's one of my faves. Again, I'm logged in as admin. Mother. Oh, missing the end of my PHP for my end curly brace. Let's try that again. Okay, and there's my admin page. It's going to throw a 404 because I haven't created my page, but that's fine. Again, I'm logged in as admin. Log out, log in as the non-admin account. Yours is going to be different. Go home, and there is no admin page, and that's what we want to see. Okay, that is the goal. Log out, log in as admin, and you see the admin page. Okay, so that is one place where we can apply this role-based access control. Any questions? Now that we have that in place, let's take it to the next level. On page 5 of your handout, it talks about testing it. And I'm saying is that let's create a page called admin. We've already seen how to do this. This is my workflow. You do you. This is my workflow. I don't need the database. I need the file transfer. Again, refresh my list. The create page is nice and simple. I'm going to duplicate the create page and I'm going to call it admin, admin.php. So now I have an admin page. I can open it up in my text editor, and then I can take the admin code from the document. You can do whatever you want, okay? I would actually recommend that if you don't want to do an admin page, you know what would be good? Is you can put this code in your create content page, okay? You do you. I now add this code to the admin page, and we're going to come back to it. I'm going to save it so I can now, when I check out the admin page, I do have, and it complains you already have a session running. That's an easy fix. I don't need a session if I already have session done in the menu. Don't need that. Save that. Reload this page. Perfect. You are admin. Now here's the real test. Log out. Log in as somebody else. I'm going to log in as non-admin. And I do not see. But I know there's an admin page. I'm going to change the URL to admin.php. And when I do that, it says, hey, you should not be here. Because not only can we use the PHP RBAC on our menu, we can use it on any content that we want. All right? We are going to, again, verify that this person is admin. If they are admin, perfect. Otherwise, no, you do not get to see the functionality on this PHP page. And that's what I'm showing you here. Okay? Any questions on that? I got it all. Okay? The rest of the document shows that, and as I had expected, this took about 1 hour. So, by way of recap, we did a couple of things. We first of all backed up our site and backed up our database. This is not required, this is just a good idea, because as you can see with me, I showed up ill-prepared, I had the wrong stuff in place. I'd like to say I did that on purpose to show you the value of having good backups, but we all know it was a lie, it was a pure screw-up on my part. Nevertheless, it's good to do a backup of your web content. If you're going to do a backup of your web content, you know what? Do a backup of your database at that point as well and save it with your content. Once we had that done, we ran the SQL script to create the necessary tables in our database, and it populated with some default rules and permissions that we wanted to use. We wanted to create our own, so we created a file, and unfortunately I believe I've deleted that file. We created a file based on this content in our support notes from today. We created this file to populate it with a role and a permission called admin. We then synced that up to our existing account that we wanted to give admin roles and permissions too. In my case, I created a user called admin. I captured that user ID and I added it in the lookup or the cross-referencing table that the PHP RBAC software uses. I then ran this script. I only want to run it once. And that populated the tables with the new roles and permissions and created a reference, or relationship I should say, to my existing admin account, which we have in the database here, and you can also see it here. 5 goes against 2, which is the admin role, which jives with the members table here. Once I had that, I added the necessary code to my site. The easiest way to do that was to add it to a file that every page that is customer facing uses. I decided to add that to my menu so that everything uses it. And when I do that, of course, I want to remove anything that might use session start because the session is already started. Don't want to throw warnings, so we can clean that up. I add the require once code because it needs the auto load to make sure that it works, and then once it has it in place, it's good to go. I instantiate a new instance of PHP RBAC, a new class, and then I get the admin role because that's the role that I want to work with. I compare that against the session value. Okay, we grabbed the session information, we grabbed the session username before, but we also grab a session user ID now. Compare that against the role that I want to give this permission to. If they compare, give them access to that resource. We can do it on a menu item. We can also do it on specific content. It is the same code. Are there any questions? I am going to stop recording at this time. That's it for me for today. You can spend the rest of today working on getting your competencies done if you have any outstanding competencies. This is a competency. I'm going to ask you to hold off on showing me this competency until you have your brute force in place. Okay? If you really must, because you're one of those compulsive types that you have it done and you want to get the marks right away, of course you can show me your competency. But the competency for this and for brute force are basically can be done at the same time. So I would prefer if you showed me both at the same time. I will not force you to do it. Any questions? Okay, I'm going to stop recording at this time.